Hello, namaskar, and welcome to Global Manthan, churning the ocean of knowledge to obtain the nectar of truth. Hello, namaskar, and welcome everyone once again. Welcome to Global Manthan, where today we churn not only the ocean of knowledge, but an ocean of history, culture, and politics to obtain the Amrit, the nectar of truth. Today, we talk about one of the most controversial and ever-burning issues as old as mankind, the Israel and Palestine conflict. And to navigate this deeply layered terrain, I'm joined by my Sherpa, Professor Dr. Christoph Frei, a great friend of our show and an expert on the topics of international relations and political science. Professor, welcome back to Global Manthan.
Thank you very much for having me, Ritvik.
Today's episode is titled Riviera, symbolizing a seemingly serene seascape, and yet it is one which is fraught with turbulent undercurrents. That has, Professor, been the story of the conflict, hasn't it been?
Absolutely. Sad is one of those terms that seem fitting. Another one would be tragic. Tragic in that you have so many recurrent patterns and we seem unable to escape them.
That is true. That is true. And the idea here behind this podcast and for discussing this topic in particular is to provide a modicum of truth, to provide some ground rules or some sort of base realities which we can offer to the world and to the viewers, to the listeners, where they can sort of separate fact from fiction, separate the narrative from what is the absolute truth, and we just offer our 2 cents on this burning issue and this topic. And we will move with deliberate pace here because otherwise, condensing almost 2,000 years of history is simply not possible within the time frame we have. But to provide that proper force for the churning, as we do on the Global Manthan podcast, we will, or at least I will, try to push back Professor on certain topics. Maybe it might seem like taking sides, but that is the conspicuous nature of the act that we will do here, so that you, the viewer, can discern the truth from the narrative and separate fact from fiction. Professor, without further ado, I think let's begin. However, when I think about beginning, do I start really 2,500 years ago, or is there a way to reduce this complexity and focus on what is really relevant and the cause of the modern tensions?
Oh, well, if you look at the history as such, obviously it's hard to even find a beginning. You really have to go a long way back to the first settlements in that area, which were neither Jewish nor Palestinian, so to speak. There were people living in that area long before the Jewish, for example, would come and take and inhabit land. But, one way of, let's say, reducing that ocean of complexity really is to perhaps ask, when did the conflict in its modern format begin? What are the beginnings of what we have in place today? And if that is the issue, then you don't have to go back several thousand years. You may actually start just 140 years ago.
That would be a great starting point as well, because when we think about civilizational births and civilizational inheritance, this is an area which has really been the cradle of human civilization, the cradle of human knowledge. And yet, when we talk about the specific issue at hand and we talk about the modern problems, then I think the 140-year bracket that we are talking about is perhaps the most accurate one, as you suggest.
Absolutely. It's first of all, it's closer to home in terms of our own experience. It's also closer to home in terms of, let's say, robust knowledge, robust evidence, much less interpretation, many more facts, which always helps in an attempt at trying to stay on the impartial side of things.
Mm-hmm. That's true. So you would suggest perhaps we start in 1881, when the birth of the Zionist movement, the birth of the Aliyah, or the return, the word Aliyah meaning return, was born. Could you tell us perhaps a little bit about that?
Sure, I should be glad to. I guess the one crucial element that we must keep in mind if we want to do justice to the history or to the circumstances at the time, the one crucial thing to keep in mind, we are not looking at this area in question. We're not looking at a modern territorial state in place. Not at all. We're rather looking at the fringes, the periphery of the Ottoman Empire.
That's true.
And an empire is something so different from a territorially nicely delimited kind of state as we know them today. So in that area, and we may perhaps later speak about Europe at the same time, but in the area in question, we're in the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire was basically marked by huge ethnic, cultural, religious diversity. So, you just don't want to conceive of anything such as a nation state in that area. It's just not happening.
Perhaps if I may also open up this topic a little bit, we're talking about a time, the Great Game began in the 1818s, right? The two big imperial empires, the Russian Empire and the British one, and they are coloring the map quite so as it happened during the Cold War as well. But the Great Game began, and there in the middle you had this Ottoman Empire that we speak of. And for the viewers, I will be happy to share the map that you shared with me, which also very accurately depicts what were the nation states at that time. However, when you see the Arabian Peninsula and you see the Levant and this whole area, well, these are modern terms for the viewers, but back then, really, what Professor is saying is that there was no formal nation state. However, there were external powers present here.
Absolutely. And this is, the important thing, because the Ottoman Empire is in retreat. They are retreating. They're losing territory to those who are pushing from the outside. And the most important power that's really pushing against the Ottoman Empire at the time is the British Empire, coming in from North Africa in what today or through what today is Libya, Egypt. It's really pushing against or towards the Ottoman Empire. And as you say, on the other side, really, in terms of directions, you have the Russian Empire, which is not at the time the Soviet Union as yet, but another empire, also not an territorially delimited modern state at all, but rather another empire with, numerous ethnic groups, tons of languages, and so forth, conglomerates of people, so to speak. But the interesting thing about, the Ottoman Empire at that time is that these ethnic groups, the religious diversity, it worked rather well. I would even say there was such a thing as tolerance. In closer to Europe, you may look at Sarajevo at the same time, where you had Christians, Muslims, you had Jewish people. And the same is true for the Levant. These people are not fighting each other. They were on the fringes of the Ottoman Empire, but they were, I should say, living more or less peacefully next to each other. And that's not a minor thing to mention.
Right. I will condense a little bit of the ancient history into a few minutes, or let's say less than a minute. this area, of course, had the Jewish trace back their heritage here to this area, to Jerusalem in particular. However, throughout the annals of history, we will find that the Jewish diaspora, or the Jewish, began dispersing into different countries, different places, as we talk about, and we fast forward to 1881. So there is some Jewish presence here, but not quite a lot.
We're looking at perhaps 1.5% of the local population in the land as being Jewish. The Jews had been expelled by the Romans some 1800 years earlier, right?
True.
So, there were a few Jewish people left, but it's really a tiny minority in 1881.
Yes, and that is the perfect place for us to now start our journey traversing this landscape. 1881, or around that time. And we talked about Russia. Many people might be surprised when we're talking about Israel, Palestine. Why are we talking about Russia? But really, that was the birthplace of the Zionist movement, which then led to the Aliyahs, the homecoming. And perhaps that's a great place to start. There are two individuals which come to my mind, Theodor Herzl and Eliezer ben Yehuda, who were really the founders of this movement. What was really happening in Russia at this time?
You may, Ritwik, you bring in Russia. I would perhaps even bring in a few other European countries, more to the west of Russia. Why? Because the mood in Europe and the political culture in Europe is in stark contrast to what you have in the Ottoman Empire on one hand and in Russia on the other. What am I talking about? I am talking about the idea of the nation and of the nation state. And that, of course, is a totally different vision of how people should organize and live next to each other, in that the nation state, an idea that basically goes back to the years and decades after the French Revolution, Napoleon, that the French would fight for themselves, the French nation. And of course, the idea of the nation state then would take hold across Europe. And the idea was to basically organize the Italians in an Italian nation state, 1861. The Germans, the belated nations, in a German nation, 1870 and 1871 with Bismarck. So the idea of organizing all the Italians in one state, of organizing all the Germans in one state, and here comes a very ugly concomitant or a very ugly aspect of the idea of the nation state, and that is, what do we do with all the others? And of course, one minority present in so many European societies at the time were the Jews.
Yep.
And the same holds true for Russia. And that brings me back to your intro here, your question, Ritwik. Why would such an idea of a Jewish nation, why would it pop up all of a sudden? And the answer is, well, it's not popping up all of a sudden. It's just the transfer of the idea of giving a state to a nation, the transfer of that idea, the adoption of that idea to the Jewish people, because they were really getting under pressure. They were under heavy pressure in so many places, starting with Russia, Poland, Eastern Europe. So, when you are a minority and you basically are a scapegoat for most everything, you start to think about, what can be done? And Theodor Herzl, whom you mentioned, Moses Hess, Leon Pinsker, there were many other authors who would start writing about, what about a Jewish nation state? What about a homeland for us? if we are, and since we are, repressed, if we are subdued, if we are, diminished in so many ways, why wouldn't we consider creating a homeland for the Jews? And that is the very birth of Zionism.
Yep. Another context there. So when Professor talks about repression, there were actually in the Eastern Europe pogroms being carried out where Jews were not only being expelled from their homes, their businesses being burnt down, but literally on the streets being killed for sport. That had something, definitely had to do with the birth of the identity of the nation states, of religious or perhaps linguistic identity being more homogeneous, and therefore the other here were the Jews. And therefore, when everyone was talking about the nation state, they also perhaps thought about this or the Eliezer ben Yehuda, that Hebrew being the linguistic identity of a possible Jewish nation state.
Correct. And the irony of all of this is that when you look at the facts, in so many places, the Jewish were so well integrated or even assimilated to local culture. I mean, if you look at Germany, for example, where the Jews into World War I would fight in the ranks of the German army, the German Reich, for the emperor and so forth. On the other hand, yes, there were also places where the Jews were not as well assimilated or integrated, in that they would really try to cultivate their own language, Hebrew or Yiddish, or I should really say Yiddish rather than Hebrew in Europe. But yes, so there were differences, but it is a good thing to recall that in so many places across Europe, the Jews were extremely well integrated. At the same time, it was still rather easy to identify them as a group. Right. They had synagogues, they had their own ways of doing things, they had their own subculture, so to speak. So when anti-Semitism really became stronger, and anti-Semitism is an ugly concomitant of the nation state in Europe, because they were one of those groups that could be easily identified as the other. And othering, as we know, Ritwik, is something that's close to all of us, deeply ingrained, so to speak, in our biological or evolutionary setup.
The ugly side of human nature, I guess, to simply put it. So we talked about the Jews in Russia and in Europe. We talked about the word Zionism. What really was Zionism?
Zionism basically comes with two components, and here we may as well just look at Theodor Herzl himself, who was not the founding father of Zionism, but who was one of those individuals who would help give more thrust, give more of an organized structure to Zionism. So Theodor Herzl himself, he identified two components to Zionism. One was nationalism. It really is the idea that the Jews too should have their nation state, much as the French, the Italians, the Germans, the Belgians, and so forth.
Right.
The second component, and this sometimes goes lost, is that Theodor Herzl was European. And, 1881, the 1880s, the 1890s, into the early 20th century, it is the time of European imperialism. And imperialism at that time results in colonialism.
Yes.
It is the idea of bringing the blessings of European civilization to the outside world. Yeah. And believe it or not, Herzl was as much European as he was Jewish. In fact, Herzl himself would sometimes make very snide remarks against the lower segments of the Jews. So there was infighting already. Right. Also another very human saying. So the two components, colonialism as bringing the blessings to lower people, is there racism, implied? Well, let's say it's the cultural arrogance. Yeah, we, the Europeans, know much better. We rule the world. And at the time, if you look at Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, Southeast Asia, even into China, look, the Europeans were the masters of the world at the time. Whether we like it or not today, it was a reality then.
Yep. I mean, I know that from personal experience as well. Not my personal experience, but coming from India, where colonialism was at its peak at the time as well. So you are talking about something very interesting here, that the birth of a Jewish nation state was not only seeped in nationalism, but one of its founders was also having some sort of a colonial mindset at the time as well, which is important for the context that we are trying to build and when we move on towards later events in history.
Absolutely. And from today's view, it's almost, it's not politically correct to say that, Herzl had colonial, colonial affinities. Yes, because he was in Austria-Habsburg. It was an empire. And Vienna and Budapest, very close to Herzl, Budapest in today's Hungary, hey, come on, those were the capitals of the world in so many ways.
Definitely.
Not perhaps fashion, but, Budapest, the first subway in continental Europe. It was just, Vienna and Budapest were like the most modern, cosmopolitan to some extent cities.
The Rome of their times.
Yep, the Rome of their times, along with, of course, London, British Empire, Paris, the French colonies, and so forth. But Ritwik, here you begin to see what really may be framed as the basic fundamental problem. On the one hand, that multicultural reality in the Ottoman Empire, and then from the outside, from Europe, the idea of creating a Jewish state in exactly that area, which today is Israel and Palestine. You see the conflagration of two utterly incompatible concepts, a multicultural, diversity on one hand, which is what you have on the ground at the time, and then the idea of a nation state in that very area. What a tension.
Definitely. Pardon me if I push back now for the first time, but 1881 was not when the Jewish nation state really began to show its, this was just the birth of the idea. It was in the coming decades until 1948 that one by one steps were being taken to make that dream a reality, right? And we talk about anti-Semitism, perhaps as a definition for the viewer and a listener. Semitic or Sami in Arabic are religions which are based in an Abrahamic faith, in a book. Stories which sound very similar to each other and yet are quite different and become the founding of three different religions. So anti-Semitism in that sense is not only anti-Jewish sentiment, it can also mean anti-Muslim sentiment or anti-Christian if you really look at the definition. However, in modern colloquialism, anti-Semitism mostly refers to anti-Jewish sentiment as mostly people understand it. What I'm pushing back on here is I need to still understand, and the viewer along with me, what was the idea of this resettlement. These religions, especially Judaism in particular, talk about the promised land. So what was the aliyah, the resettlement, the first move in 1881 to move to that promised land?
And when that move actually set in, or when that movement set in, the aliyahs, bringing Jews back to, as you say, as you put it, Ritwik, the promised land, let's not forget, and we've mentioned it already, there were very, very few Jews in that area. So to begin with, there were very few Jews around. But and this is another irony or an ironic twist to that whole story. Early on, the Zionists argued about where to go. It was not clear that they would go back to Palestine, to that area. They were talking about stretches into the east of Africa. They were talking about Latin America, what today would be Argentina. So all kinds of ideas were floated. All kinds of ideas were pitched at the time. And it was only as time went by into the 1890s and then into the early 1900 years, 20th century, that the Jewish orthodoxy kind of would dominate and would win that battle or that discourse or those discussions. And from then on only was it really clear that the target or the destination in terms of homeland actually was the origin. But that was not clear from the outset. And it needs to be, recalled also in light of, today's discussions when, Stevie Witkoff, one of Trump's special envoys to the Middle East, when he suggests that we may actually put the Palestinians elsewhere. Well, the idea of just displacing people for the Jews, 1881, in the late 19th century, it was a crucial question. Where shall we go?
Right. And the pin on the map stopped at Jerusalem and the area of the Levant, this very narrow strip. I mean, I will put this up for the viewers and the listeners. But more importantly, this came after a lot of ideas, as you said, had been thrown around. So it was not obvious from the get-go that the Jews think of that part of the world as their homeland. It is only after practical and the group that won, as you speak, the Jewish Orthodoxy, that this became a reality. How did this resettlement start taking place?
You really want to look, we are looking at a very gradual process, wave after wave. In 1910, 30 years into Aliyahs, we're still looking at very small numbers, perhaps 4% of the population in what today is Israel and Palestine. And it really took a long time. All the time, the Zionists were, let's say, they were absorbed with fundraising on one hand, really drawing money, for example, from rich Jewish families in Europe and in the United States. But they were also trying to muster political support for the idea, because the idea of establishing a nation state or a homeland, as was the term at the time for the Jewish, that idea was not popular. It had to really become, or it had to be diffused. So the Zionists were starting to talk to Istanbul. They were talking to the Catholic Church in Rome. They were talking to the British. They were talking to the French. They were starting to talk to the Americans. So the Zionists became very systematic in terms of what today would be political lobbying.
I see.
And at the same time, on the ground, you had, beginning with Russia and Poland, you had people, Jews coming back to the area, so to speak, making or creating facts on the ground. But it was a slow and gradual process. And the first major breakthrough, of course, came with the Balfour Declaration.
Right. And now we're making that leap towards a point in time, which was very crucial for this whole, not only the podcast, but this discussion itself. Balfour Declaration, 1917. 1917 also being the year when the Bolsheviks overthrew the Tsar in Russia. A lot of people might find it interesting that the Jews were very much at the forefront of the Bolshevik revolution as well. Karl Marx himself being a Jew, Rosa Luxemburg. So very prominent Marxists, Leninists of the time were very much Jewish. And so when the power struggle was happening and a certain group came to the power after the October Revolution, Jews were also part of it. Perhaps that's also important because without wielding power or without being in the echo chambers of power, you cannot bring forth change. That's my belief.
Correct, Ritwik. I would complement that bit or that element of information by another important element of information. The British, 1917, we're in World War I. And the British were themselves lobbying for support against the Ottoman Empire. And how would they do that? Resources, both financial and human, well, they would make promises. So they made promises to the Arabs in the Levant, promising them, the Hashemites, for example, the Hashemite throne, if you help us against stupid, bloody, evil Ottomans, we will reward you by establishing a monarchy for you, the Hashemites, in the area. Yep. And to the Jews, they made a promise, the famous Balfour Declaration, promising the Jews a homeland for themselves in 1917, right? Yep. So the British made pledges and promises to all sides, also for very pragmatic political reasons. They needed to muster support in their fight against the Ottoman Empire, amongst other opponents and enemies.
Yep, statecraft, but colonial statecraft in the
Absolutely.
I mean, no one knows that better than India about British making promises and not keeping them at the end of it. That is precisely what happened towards the end of this quarter of a century. However, we stay in 1917 just for a little bit. The Balfour Declaration, named after Stephen Balfour, was a cabinet proposal, the British cabinet proposal, parliamentary proposal, which aimed to resettle the Jews in the area of Israel, what is modern-day Israel. And this was perhaps the first written, documented promise explicitly mentioning that. However, when I put this up for the viewers, they will also notice that it also mentions the very words without prejudice to the other communities or the other people living in the region that this resettlement would come about. Seemingly innocuous, right? So in a way, innocent.
Very important thing that you mention here. Yes, the British made that pledge to help the Zionists establish a homeland for themselves. In tit for tat, in exchange, they were given support by the Zionist movement in their war efforts. There is one wonderful anecdote, but it's a very true, of course. It's not just an anecdote. It's a very true established fact of history. If you look at the British cabinet in 1917, there was one Jewish member of the British cabinet. His name was Edwin Montagu. And is it not interesting that Edwin Montagu, a Jewish aristocrat, was against the Balfour Declaration? Why? Montagu said, what? Here we are in the World War I, nation state pitted against nation state, a deadly conflagration of nationalisms. And what are we doing? We're about to create yet another nation state. How utterly unmodern is it what we're doing? So I think it's worth remembering Montagu and his resistance to the Balfour Declaration. He, of all people, was a Jew, and he said, let's not fall back into nationalism. Look what happens with World War I. These are European nation states going for each other, and we're about to create another nation state. Come on.
Oh, that is such an interesting and very, how do you say, a poignant sign of the times, because not only did people not listen to people like Montague, the whole continent went into a sort of amnesia, and pardon me for saying that, but for the next 25 odd years until 1939-45, the events of World War II happened, people really forgot that nationalism can be very, very dangerous.
Absolutely. I mean, World War I came to an end, and it is also worth remembering that in the wake of World War I, there are the first pan-European ideas popping up. Why? Because it was so obvious that nation states had, been responsible for World War I. It's precisely the idea of my nation first, my nation is superior, So what I'm saying is transnational, post-national or supranational ideas really in Europe came up in the 1920s, whereas in the Levant, the Zionists would steadily, stubbornly go on pursuing their dream of establishing a nation state for themselves. Small wonder then that in the 1920s, as numbers grew, resistance on the ground, and here we would for the first time speak about Palestinian resistance to Jewish settlers, that we're looking at the early 1920s.
Right. We would now deliberately move towards 1948 straight away, but not without acknowledging the fact that you just mentioned 1922, 1920s were the second and the third aliyahs. Yeah. So more and more movement of the Jewish people back into what was now being proclaimed as their homeland in the area of nearby Jerusalem and modern-day Israel. It's also important to mention that there were multiple riots now then happening in that area now. Despite the fact that this area, when the first aliyah came, the Arabs, the Palestinian people, they actually welcomed a lot of the Jews coming in at the time. It is only when this movement became more and more politically colored that there were fractures beginning to take place. It was also the birth of Haganah, or the defense movement. Haganah being a word for defense in Hebrew, I think. And the birth of parties like Irgun as well, who were beginning to take force for this resettlement that was now taking place. We move now to 1948. What happened here?
That's quite a jump, quite a movement forward. What happened? First of all, you have a most crucial event or process during World War II, and that is the Holocaust.
Yes.
We cannot understand the creation of the State of Israel in 1948 without the Holocaust.
That
The fact is, Ritwik, that at the end of the 1930s, the British, who were in charge of that that region, it was a mandate under the League of Nations. The British were in charge of administering that mandate. And the British were absolutely lost in that they were unable to mitigate the growing tension between the Jewish settlers, the Zionists, and the local populations. And before we go on to 48, there is one detail that we need to talk about. That is 1937, when a commission, the Peel Commission in London, for the first time suggested a two-state solution. Meaning that, on the one hand, we have the Balfour Declaration, we have our own promise to the Zionists, and we have so many. And here we're talking already about something like 20%, 18% of the population is Jewish in Palestine. So there is this reality, the fact on the ground. And the British say, we have to somehow make or do justice to the Balfour Declaration. We have to. And this is prior to World War II. So the Brits were thinking about a two-state solution Of course, the Palestinians, they didn't accept the idea. How could they? Because for them, those were intruders. Yeah. And they were not even thinking about ceding formal jurisdiction to these people. It was one thing to basically live with them, but it was an utterly different thing to concede this European idea of statehood to these people.
From 1.5% in 1881 to now, you mentioned 18% in just
the late 1930s.
Less than a century.
So you're looking at hundreds of thousands now, right? Going beyond 1 million. Right. So those are the numbers. Yep. And so at the time, the two-state solution was not at all a notion that people would know beyond Great Britain, beyond a few diplomats in the colonial office, right? So the Holocaust really changed a lot. And the second thing, Ritwik, after World War II, not just did the Holocaust become notorious, a fact, the images, the visuals from Auschwitz, the concentration camps, Dachau, Auschwitz, and so forth. And the second thing, of course, is the end of World War II also brought the moral breakdown, so to speak, of colonialism. Mahatma Gandhi goes to London, you know that very, very well. Yep. And so the moral foundation of colonialism had just withered away. Right. So you had the Holocaust. Right. You had the end of colonialism as an established right, so to speak, for the masters of the world in Europe. So take the two together, and there you have the basic reasons of why the United Nations General Assembly would issue a resolution that would take up the Peel Commission two-state solution, and that's in 1947. And they said, this is what we're going to do, a two-state solution. And the Israeli side, the Jewish side, would live up, take that, accept it, and go forward with the declaration of Israeli independence in May 48.
Right. 1947 being the year of independence for India as well. That's how I remember it primarily. 1947 also being when the idea of an Israeli independence then comes to the fore. Yeah. And as you mentioned, after UN General Assembly Resolution 181, that the Jewish state, or the creation of a Jewish state, along with a Palestinian state, and just for the viewers, the Resolution 181 took upon that two-state solution. So there will be an independent state of Palestine, there will be an independent state of Israel, with Jerusalem being a shared capital, but being administered by United Nations security forces. That was the idea there. May 1948, Palestine or Palestinian people do not accept the proposal, and immediately a war takes place.
Ritwik, I think here it really is important, for the sake of trying to do justice to what happened. It is important to put on the table that not just the Palestinians did not accept the two-state solution as propagated by the United Nations General Assembly. All the Arab neighbors of Israel did not accept the creation of Israel.
Right.
How could they? Again, how would they? How could they? Because if you start to, and we have to, look at this aliyahs from the Arabic side, from the Palestinian side. Yes. Hey, come on. Why would you pay a price for the Holocaust? Why would you accept paying a price in terms of territory to the fact that the rest of the world, the Europeans, felt bad about the Shoah, about the Holocaust, but us, the Palestinians, have now to pay a price and give half of our territory to the Jews? Are you kidding me? So that was the kind of perception on the Arab side. Yes, they resented the Holocaust. The Muslims, they were never friendly to the Holocaust, but they would say, the Holocaust is not our doing. This was the Germans, aided by some other Europeans. They would go after the Jews, not us.
Which is why in Palestinian memory, 48 rather, is also remembered as Nakba, an injustice to them. Because for one side, it was a matter of existence, right? When this war happened in 1948 between Israel and what was now Palestine, there was the Palestinians and the Arabs, of course, being supported by Egypt, by Jordan, Syria as well. However, the Israelis fought back and they kind of won a lot of territory here. And how was it that the Jews already had amassed enough power to push back on that front? Because for them it was a war of existence, whereas for the Palestinian side and for the Arab states it was more of a matter of prestige, if I may read that in my interpretation.
No, I think there is a lot to your interpretation. It can be corroborated through solid arguments quite easily. Look, why was Israel well prepared for the war that broke out in 1948, immediately following, a few hours following the Declaration of Independence by David Ben-Gurion in May 1948? Why was Israel prepared? The answer is quite straightforward, because by 1922, with the foundation or founding of the Haganah that you've mentioned, that was the core of what today is the Israeli Defense Forces. It was the core cell of the Israeli army. It was a movement created and then equipped, developed, expanded throughout the 1920s, 1930s, because the Jewish side, the Zionists, were preparing themselves for day X in 1948, because they knew this was their destination in terms of acknowledgement or in terms of recognition by the rest of the world, the implementation of the Balfour Declaration. So we will have a Jewish state, and we know for sure that the Arabs are not going to like it. So we prepare. So Israel, believe it or not, was well prepared. Do not forget, Redwick, that you have many, many people in the Haganah who had fought in Europe in World War I. You had engineers, you had officers, you had people who knew what they were doing. And also they had this purpose, a seriousness of purpose. They knew exactly what they were fighting for, and that is Israel, the establishment of Israel. Now look at the other side. As you mentioned, the Palestinians didn't really have an inkling of the idea of the nation state. Why would they know a lot about nation states? For the Muslims, the idea of a modern territorial state is a rather alien concept. The Muslims are the Ummah, the community of believers. That's Islam. And so the idea, or let me say, nationalism really had to come to the Palestinians first, and they were not nearly as well prepared. And the same, of course, goes for surrounding neighboring countries, Egypt, Syria, Jordan. They were all talking about, expulsing the Jews, throwing them back into the sea. And they really meant it, but they were not very well prepared.
So even the modern, Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, not so much Lebanon, but Jordan, they were not nation states in the meaning of the word.
They were sovereign states in that they had become independent, Ritwik, but that's about that.
Okay. So the idea which you mentioned.
So the social reality and the socio-economic and the socio-cultural reality on the ground in the Arab world was just not, this is not Europe with nation states and armies and all that. Yes, they had armed forces, but in terms of quality, in terms of know-how, in terms of even technology, weaponry, and so forth, you're just not looking at symmetry. It's an asymmetric situation, which is why Israel handily won the War of Independence in 1948, and, as you mentioned, would expand the territory already at the price or at the cost of the Palestinian state.
We will now build upon that. So continuing this conversation even further, 1948, war breaks out. Israel gains even more territory, more than what the two-state solution was about. The maps will be there for people to see what actually happened, the pre and post 1948. Palestinians, of course, remember is it as the Nakba, where the injustice was taking place to them. Let's move forward to another important, crucial point in time, the year 1967. However, before we mention that, maybe it's also helpful to remember that a lot happened between 1948 and 67, in that the Suez Crisis, where Egypt under Gamal Abdel Nasser was threatening to take extensive military action against Israel for its actions. More importantly, it threatened to close the passage of ships through the Suez Canal. However, the Israeli fighters also pushed back against it and actually captured the Sinai Peninsula, which is a part of Egypt. And they only gave it back when they allowed Israel to have certain rights in that small passage between the Red Sea and what is the Jordan River, and also the passage of ships through the Suez Canal.
Ritwik, rather than focusing on the Suez Crisis, 56 and 57, let me perhaps try to embed the whole stretch ranging from 48, independence for Israel, creation of Israel, into 67. Mm-hmm. Most importantly, from the very beginning, we're looking at violence.
Right.
And that, the implication is, look, this was not just about, rhetoric and verbal attacks. From the very beginning, this was about to be or not to be. Mm-hmm. It is important to keep in mind that the Arabs did want to throw back the Jews into the seas. That's what they announced. But it is also important to recall that for the Palestinians, the Nakba is not just the recognition of a Jewish state. The Nakba came with violence. It meant physical expulsion, of Palestinians from their villages. 720,000 Palestinians lost their homes during the War of Independence in 48. So the Nakba has a very physical connotation for the Palestinians. The Jews had the Holocaust, but whether we like it or not, the Palestinians had the Nakba of 48. And it meant physical expulsion. It brought ethnic cleansing. One of the most famous Jewish generals, Moshe Dayan, he acknowledged all these injustices as committed. So it was brutal on both sides. Mm-hmm. It was really existential. It started to become existential very, very early on. And this Ritwik would then drag into the 50s and into the 60s, not in terms of violent war going on all the time, but the physical expulsion of the Palestinians on one hand, and then the political tension with Muslim neighbors, Muslim countries, Muslim societies surrounding Israel. And there, of course, the Suez Crisis is a wonderful example of just how tense things were. But let us not forget that in 56 and 57, it was the United States who would really put their heavy hand on Israel to moderate Israeli behavior towards their neighbors. So David and Goliath, it's more complicated than that.
That is true. And we will talk about external actors because they play a huge role in this conflict, especially now during the modern era as well. We move to 67 because that is a point or a juncture in history where you mention that the lines between oppressed and oppressor started become blurry, or let's say much more clear as to who moved in a certain direction. What happened? The 1967 Six-Day War, as it is called.
It's really crucial because in so many ways everything happened. Everything changed, Ritwik. Everything really changed in 67. Why? Yeah. Well, I went to primary school in the 1960s. Mm-hmm. And believe it or not, we were told almost on a daily basis in 67, the war, oh, small Israel, the David, they are defending themselves against Goliath, which is the Egyptians, the Syrians. Everybody's trying to smash and destroy Israel. And lo and behold, Israel won a decisive victory within just a few days. Yeah. That's why it's called the Six-Day War, right. Moshe Dayan. And for us, it was like a miracle. Today, Ritwik, I have a somewhat changed perspective because in terms of military preparedness, once again, Israel was strong already. And they had a mighty uncle helping them, and that was the United States of America. So what happened? What changed? Why is it so important to talk about it's 1967? Because from then on, with the results of that war, Israel occupied land. They occupied the West Bank. They occupied the Gaza Strip. They occupied all of Sinai. They would occupy the Golan Heights to the north, in the triangle Lebanon, Syria, and Israel. So Israel won a decisive military victory. And that was the beginning of what many people within Israel today call the beginning of hubris. What am I talking about? Mm-hmm. It is the fact that this decisive military victory turned into a cognitive pattern, a cognitive position on the side of Israel, and that is, we can manage this whole situation through military superiority. We are stronger, and we have to make sure to keep everybody else at arm's length. Full spectrum dominance, that's what we need. Because, as has been demonstrated by Moshe Dayan and the wonderful victory as won by the Israeli Defense Forces, IDF, we can manage this situation through military strength. That's one aspect. And the second aspect, of course, is physical occupation on the ground. Ever since 1967, Israel, actually in the fall of that year, Israel started to settle in the occupied territories. Mm-hmm. They would later withdraw from the Gaza Strip. That's correct. 30 years later, 2000s, they would withdraw from Gaza, but they would never, ever withdraw from the West Bank anymore. Mm-hmm. So why is that crucial? Right. Because what used to be David against Goliath in the eyes of the rest of the world, it now becomes more and more obvious, a slow process of dawning in public opinion around the world, that Israel is not just defending itself. Israel has a very proactive way of defending itself by settling in the West Bank and in Gaza. And that, of course, was illegal in terms of not complying with the famous resolution and the two-state solution. So, just to end this little element here, mm-hmm. Occupying territory, for years, settling in a territory for years, does something to both sides in terms of cognitive, in terms of perception. Mm-hmm. Johan Galtung would, in the 1990s, that's 30 years ago, Johan Galtung, a Norwegian peace researcher, Galtung would say, what we have in Israel is a new kind of apartheid. Of course it's not South Africa, but we have occupiers and we have the occupied. And this configuration cannot help change the very self-perception and the perception of the other on the ground.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That is a very comprehensive history that you have put forth here. However, allow me to push back on two separate things. One, from my observation, from whatever I observed in the world until now, isn't that what victors do? Especially militant victors or military victors, that when you have more power, you do end up gaining territory, boosts your ego as a nation, and essentially, and I'm not being callous to the obvious human suffering here, I'm just saying, isn't that what really has happened throughout history, even with other very famous benevolent victories, military victories? Secondly, perhaps a different perspective to that, and which I also still want to understand crucially, is that by 1967, Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, these were also becoming very, very powerful. And the Palestinian cause was being brought forth not only for discussion, but there was obvious military interest in the region. How did Israel push back against these combined armies?
The historic truth in what you say is very important. It's easy to criticize Israel throughout the whole, time. But we need to keep in mind that for Israel, this is about, again, being or not being. For Israel, this is about its very existence.
Yes.
From Nasser down to Hamas. They want to destroy Israel. So we always need to keep that in mind. Yeah. It's cheap talk comes easy, right? At the same time, and this being said, you say, is that not what always happens? Does the victor not always take the spoils and enjoy its victory and dwell in it? And the answer is no. Look at the Marshall Plan. Look at what United States did to Japan and to Germany. They would rebuild these societies. They would actually not humiliate the opponent or the foe, the enemy. No, they would reach out and bring them up again. Why am I reminding us of the United States position? Because in 1967, after that decisive victory, many voices in Israel said, give back the land. Do not occupy it. We will taint ourselves. We will become tainted if we stay. So there were many Jewish voices propagating, moderation. Because if we stay, we will become as bad as others. And Ritwik, these were famous Jewish voices, yes, even out of the military, even in the armed forces. So what I'm saying is Israel did have a choice. Mm-hmm. Israel, in the enthusiasm, in the glory of the victory, they conceived the famous Plan Alon. And the Plan Alon, of course, was a scheme by which you settle you allow for Jewish settlements. Actually, you support Jewish settlements in the occupied territories in order to establish facts on the ground. And look where this has brought us by 2025.
Right. Should we now make another quantum leap here? Because now so to speak, the floor is open for our discussion about this Riviera, the Gaza Strip in particular, because that is where the modern era, the very current phase of this war is breaking out. Before even talking about 2023, it's also imperative to talk about 2021. And I'm glad that we began this discussion with 1881, because the years 1881 and then so on and so forth have very much in common with what transpired in 2021. The first Aliyah, the local population, the Arab Palestinians living in East Jerusalem at that time, did not oppose the Jewish coming in. And at that point in time, some wealthy Jewish landowner, businessmen came to own and buy some land from Palestinians and Arabs living in that region. Fast forward to 2021 and throughout 2006 to 2021, the 21st century, a lot of artificial Israeli settlements or resettlements started happening in 2021, so much so that a lot of Israeli people also went to court to justify this. And the Israeli Supreme Court, when it was about to give the decision, there were widespread riots which broke out. The Israeli Defense Forces stormed the Masjid al-Haram, that is the Al-Aqsa Mosque, in what the Jewish people also call their Temple Mount compound in Jerusalem, the holiest of the holies. And at that time, and this was the first time in history that any military force had entered that compound, ever. And so, this gave, in my reading, a justification for certain people to legitimize Hamas, which, by the way, are terrorists. And yet, the plan of 2023 was being conceived by 2021. These are not my words. These are the words of Mohammed Deif, the commander who actually led the 2023 brutal attack against Israeli citizens. Am I correct in that reading?
You are absolutely correct. Only there is one crucial, one crucial addendum. There is one, we need to extend the story. You take Ariel Sharon, and predecessor of Bibi Netanyahu. This goes back much further. Intifada in 1980s, Intifada 1, an uprising on the part of Palestinians. Intifada 2 in the early 2000s. Ariel Sharon's provocation on the Temple Mount, provocating the Muslims and their holiest, most sacred sites, the Al-Aqsa Mosque. This is not 2021, but the configuration was in place ever after 1967. That's why 1967 is so important, in that the Muslim side, the Palestinian side, feels and they felt and they feel oppressed and suffocated all the time. So Intifada 1980s also is not the same date, but Hamas is a movement created to defend, in their view, to defend their existence against the aggression of those Jews who settle in what, in Hamas perception, is the Palestinian side of the two-state solution. Right. So, but in one aspect, it's very easy to compare Hamas and many other radical movements on the Palestinians and Arab side. Yes, you may label them terrorists. Only you will allow, you may, with good cause, describe and label them as terrorists. But let me, for the sake of trying to do justice, remind us that they themselves would not ever look at themselves as terrorists. They would look at themselves, again, as, the Mujahedin of Afghanistan. Yeah. They would look at themselves as freedom fighters, right? So there are two perceptions here, and it doesn't help us. It doesn't help solve anything if we just sit here and say, oh, on the one hand, you have terrorists, and on the other hand, you have the righteous armed forces of Israel, because for decades on end, we have had illegal settlements. And the opinions, the courts, the international bodies looking into this matter, they date from much earlier than 2021.
Right. let's talk about Hamas for a minute, for a brief, and I will push back. And the viewers had already been warned that I might do this for the purposes of my own understanding, but also the collective understanding. Right? Harkat al-Muqawamah al-Islami, Hamas, literally meaning Islamic Youth Rebellion. Mujahideen, you mentioned in Afghanistan, freedom fighters fighting against. It is very noble to fight against injustice. I mean, I understand that, especially when that occupation has been of such a kind that your very existence is being threatened. Agreed. However, the nature of fighting back and the legitimization of using force when Palestinian Authority itself is split apart. On one hand, you had Yasser Arafat, you had who is now Mahmoud Abbas leading the Fatah Party, the erstwhile Palestinian Liberation Authority or the Palestinian Liberation Organization, who, after a few decades of violence, they sought to political means of pushing back on the Israeli agenda or pushing back for their own rights and their collective existence. You have, on the other hand, Hamas, who celebrates the killing of innocent people. And I'm offering this perspective, knowing very well that you will counter this with the opposite facts as well. However, from my understanding, when I saw the events that transpired on October 7th, 2023, I was horrified beyond imagination. The celebration of taking innocent civilians, women on the back of the bikes, naked, and being people within the Gaza Strip clapping and chanting when this procession was taking place. For me, Hamas, by doing so, is even more so a terrorist organization, because you cannot celebrate. You can fight back. Of course, armed resistance is good against injustice. But to my understanding, the celebration of killing of innocent civilians and celebrating the disturbing images that came out was really too much to handle. And I allow you to retort and to allow me to see another perspective.
You cannot retort against what you say. It's unforgivable. It's absolutely, the opposite of humanity. It's, the brutish force of what Hamas did on October 7th, 23. How could you possibly defend, right? As an academic, however, my job is not defending, my job is trying to understand. And rather than trying to retort, I don't want to even try to defend, but let me try to explain what makes Hamas possible, what renders Hamas possible. And there I would go back into the 1990s when my teacher at the time, when it comes to this conflict, Johann Galtung, taught me about and obliged me to look into the daily reality of Palestinians in the occupied territories. The chicanery, the obstacles, the slow and gradual suffocation by expelling them. Look at Eastern Jerusalem, the slow and gradual pushing back of Arabs living in East Jerusalem, of expulsing them, of the judiciary branch of Israel, tolerating that kind of expulsion. When the international, the ICJ, which is, the International Court of Justice of the United Nations, they're not just all a bunch of anti-Semitic idiots, but it is just a reality that for the Palestinian side, living under Israeli occupation has been living hell. And I am not trying to defend, I am only trying to understand why it is so easy to recruit young men in a fight and in a violent fight against Israel. So, yes, it is unforgivable, but the current war in Gaza is the fifth, not the first. And so we do have to go back into Intifada 1 in the 1980s, look at all the provocations on both sides.
Right.
What I'm trying to say, Ritwik, let us not lose time in trying to defend what you cannot defend, but let us merely state what we see today, which is an incapacity on both sides to even acknowledge the other side as human beings. What we have in this conflict is dehumanization. You know, for many, many people in Israel, October 7th demonstrated for all times that Palestinians are not human beings, but beasts, right? But trust me, when you live in Gaza and you just look at the past, you know, ever since October 7th, just the past, 20 months? No, about 18 months.
Yep.
If you trust me, you find reasons to consider Israelis as beasts. The number is now approaching 50,000 casualties. And please don't tell me I'm exaggerating. These are just numbers. Look at the ICRC. Look at the UNHCR. We don't need to, you know, to become ideological. Let's just stick with the facts. Hamas, 7th of October. Let's be generous in quotation marks with casualties and speak of 1,500 Israeli killed. Make it 1,600. We are now approaching 50,000 Palestinians killed. Ritwik, I'm not trying to defend either side. The sad and tragic thing is that we are losing humanity out of this conflict.
Absolutely. And that's the one truth that I 100% agree on, because the obvious human suffering, there is obviously asymmetry here, asymmetric warfare, as many people say. Who is losing? Humanity is losing, as you put, right? You talk about numbers, they are human lives. For one human life lost, a whole family suffers for a lifetime.
Exactly.
And that, when you multiply that, this is the uncomfortable truth that we have to live with. Unless we make steps, or people who are in power on both sides and their supporters, the external powers, they make certain steps to finally put an end to at least the suffering. That is something that through this podcast, you and I also have attempted to share. This is perhaps the last phase here of our discussion. I will ask you certain questions which are very important for everyone to listen to. Is the two-state solution even viable now?
It is not. It is clearly not. For the two-state solution to become viable, you would need at least 3 requirements. First of all, where on earth is an honest broker who from the outside would credibly put pressure on both sides? The only power in place who could play that role, that used to be the United States of America. Look at Jimmy Carter, look at Bill Clinton, look at Camp David. I mean, we came close a few times.
1990s.
We came close. And both sides, you know, I'm not trying to blame one side for all the, you know, the let's say, the failures of such attempts. But let me just say, we would need an honest broker with the ability and the political will to put pressure on both sides. We don't have such a broker. Second, you would need to break the radicals on both sides.
Yes.
You cannot have a two-state solution with Bibi Netanyahu and the Orthodox and nationalist and sovereignist, pro-settler, you know, members of cabinet in the Israeli government. Look at the people who are there, and then look at the other side.
Hamas.
How could you possibly trust Muhammad Sinwar, the Khaled Mashals, you know, and many other members of the Hamas Politburo, if they're still alive? Most of them are not. But how can you make and find peace with that kind of radicalism, extremism on both sides. So second requirement for a two-state solution and peace in quotation marks, I'm afraid, how do you break the veto power of those who are radical, extremist, and use violence? Mm-hmm. And the third one, look at the economic viability of a Palestinian state. It's, there has not been, even territorially speaking, the Oslo process in the 1990s. Look, with what's left of the Palestinian territory, with what's left of the Palestinian side of the two-state solution, you just don't have a contiguous territory that would be viable. So, this entity would be from the very beginning dependent to an extent that is just, not dignified,
on
not
Israeli
viable.
benevolism, for example.
Pardon me?
On Israeli benevolism.
And Europe and Qatar. I mean, the money, as I mentioned, this is Gaza war number 5. And each and every time in the past, the European Union would then, provide money and infrastructure and down to cement in order to rebuild Gaza. One of the few times that I saw Kofi Annan, Secretary General of the UN at the time, one of the few times that I saw Kofi Annan shed tears in public was when Kofi Annan spoke about let's rebuild Gaza yet again, or once again. And, so if you take these 3 elements, just only these 3, where would a two-state solution come from? And to end it all with a little ice on the caking, icing on the cake, pardon me, listen to Bibi Netanyahu, who basically tells you, not in public, but in private, he did so. We have those recordings. They were published by Haaretz, a Jewish newspaper in Israel, in order to render the two-state solution impossible. What we need is a strong Hamas. And that was, prior, obviously, to October 7th. But it's as cynical as that. The Israeli government has financed or helped finance, along with Qatar. They have, even physically transported money from Qatar to Hamas. You're looking at Mossad. So what I'm saying is divide et impera. We need the Fatah, we need the Hamas, we need them split and divided so that we have these radicals who will allow us to continue pushing with settlements in the West Bank. We have these sworn enemies of Israel, and we need sworn enemies of Israel because they give us a justification for what we're doing.
You always need an other to paint your own narrative, isn't it?
Absolutely.
I mean, there's so much that really comes to mind. Perhaps one final question, one very seemingly, and this is really me playing the devil's advocate here. Can there be a Palestinian Authority or Palestine reimagining without the Gaza Strip, for example, resettlement of those living there, as Donald Trump and his administration suggests, and true to the name of our podcast today, Riviera? Can really that be a solution there? To have only one, because that would also solve the problem we've just discussed about this non-contiguous territories being always dependent on external factors, on Israeli defense forces being benevolent, on external benevolence as well. So if you do not have one part of that territory, does that then become viable? I know it's a bad question, but is that then a possible end to this?
On paper, it would make much sense. On paper, why not dislocating the Palestinians to some other place and rebuild Gaza in the image of the Trumps and Witkoffs of this world, or Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, and you may list many names and extend the list. But look, the one thing that's really missing for such a solution, solution, such an end game to be implemented. The one thing that's really missing is the consent of the Palestinian people on the ground, Ritwik. They're not leaving. They have lost everything. They have been expulsed time and again. Look at Gaza today. Another living hell. Please don't tell me it's not a living hell. So these people are living in hell. But you know what? From all I hear out of Lebanon as well, where I have friends, look at them. They are not willing to leave, even with the rubble and the ruins. They're not willing to leave. They say, I'd rather die. Obviously, that's not true for everybody, right? But it is true for many. And 2 million is many, right? So it's a catastrophe. It's really, in terms of humanitarian affinities, the Geneva Conventions, humanitarian law, you're an international lawyer, Ritwik, amongst many other things that you are. But to have this reality is such a huge conundrum. It's such a scandal. And then to suggest, why not dislocate them? You can do it on paper. You won't be able to do it in reality, because there is such a thing as self-determination ever since Woodrow Wilson came up with this scheme well over 100 years ago. And these people are not willing to leave.
Very first article of the UN Charter, the right to self-determination. Professor, there are many things that I have perhaps yet to cover, but that's for Riviera Part 2, I would suggest. This has been an exercise to subdue the pain that you obviously feel when you talk about these things. But in that pain, you and I found some perspective. In the fire that burns due to the narrative and the propaganda and the wars, we saw some glowing embers of truth, which perhaps the viewers and the listeners would appreciate when they listen to this. We didn't resolve the conflict. We really cannot, especially two people sitting here. But we churned these waters, these oceans, and that is precisely what we began this podcast with, that perhaps through our churning, through me asking you some very uncomfortable, difficult questions, we can learn to see different perspectives, different side. To end this episode on an analogy, the more tightly we hold our fist, which has sand in it, the sand will start slipping out. The more loosely we hold on to one idea, we can see the contours of truth on the other side. And that sand, the sand of time, metaphorically speaking, and the sand of the Palestinian and the Israeli sand, the collective sands, will perhaps stay as they are, if only we allow ourselves to hold on very lightly to our own opinions and perspectives and see the other side for what it is.
It's a very lovely metaphor. From experience, I would add, if when talking about this conflict, if afterwards friends of Israel will tell you, oh, you were way too pro-Palestine, and if Palestinians will tell you, oh, but you have been very, very pro-Israel, then you've got it about right. And I think, Ritwik, that's what we need to try. It's, there ain't no such thing as one truth in this conflict. Yes, there are objective facts, but they are interpreted entirely differently by the two sides. And I have really learned that both sides come with truth because it corresponds to their personal experience. And how can you then tell people, oh, this is not true because I see it differently? This is one of the let's say, takeaways here. There may be more than one truth. And that's why political solutions are so difficult to gain.
That is true. Well, Professor, thank you very, very much for taking out this time and for sharing your perspective on such a burning issue. To the viewers, we hope that a Riviera Part 2 is talking about a Riviera and not ruins. And in that hopes, stay tuned to Global Manthan.